Edward Martin's peaceful life was upended when a ragged girl appeared claiming to be his daughter Betty's twin sister, long thought dead. Lies, scandal, and an impossible truth unraveled his family. Could they find healing and build the bond they never had? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Edward Martin stood by the playground of Oakwood Park, watching his 10-year-old daughter Betty swing back and forth. The afternoon sun made her blonde hair shine like gold. She was the image of her mother, Anna, who had passed away 2 years ago. At 45, Edward was one of the richest men in town, but money hadn't bought him peace since losing his wife. "Hiya, Daddy, hiya," Betty called out, her laughter echoing through the park. Edward smiled, but his attention was caught by movement in the shadows of the nearby trees. A small figure lurked there, a girl about Betty's age wearing torn jeans and a dirty t-shirt. Her face was smudged with dirt, but there was something familiar about her features that made Edward's heart skip a beat. The girl watched Betty, intently clutching something in her hand. After what seemed like forever, she stepped out of the shadows and walked straight up to Edward. Her chin was held high despite her ragged appearance. "That girl on the swing is my twin sister," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Edward stared at her, ready to call security. But then he really looked at her face, those same blue eyes, that same pointed chin. The girl, who introduced herself as Mary, pulled a crumpled photo from her pocket. It showed 2 identical baby girls in hospital blankets. "Where did you get this?" Edward demanded, his hands shaking as he held the photograph. "From the orphanage before I ran away," Mary answered. "They told me I had a twin, but nobody believed me when I said my father was Edward Martin." Betty had stopped swinging and was now standing beside them, looking at Mary with wide eyes. "Daddy, she looks just like me." Edward's head was spinning. He remembered the day Betty was born. Anna had been so weak after the delivery. She'd told him one of the twins hadn't survived. He'd been so worried about his wife that he never asked to see the other baby's body, never questioned the death certificate. "Come with me," he said to Mary, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." The drive back to the Martin mansion was silent. Edward kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the 2 girls sitting side by side in the back seat. The resemblance was undeniable. Betty chatted excitedly while Mary sat quietly, taking in everything with wary eyes. As they pulled up to the house, Martha, the housekeeper who had worked for them for 15 years, was waiting at the door. The moment she saw Mary, the color drained from her face. She dropped the cleaning cloth she was holding. "Martha," Edward asked sharply, "is there something you want to tell me?" Martha burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Martin. Mrs. Martin made me promise never to tell. She said she couldn't handle twins with her condition, that one baby would be hard enough." Edward felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. The perfect life he thought he had, the memory of his beloved Anna, it was all built on lies. He looked at the 2 little girls standing together on his doorstep, one in expensive clothes and the other in rags, and knew his life would never be the same. That night, after getting Mary cleaned up and settled in a guest room, Edward sat in his study, staring at the photo of Anna on his desk. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do this to our daughter?" Betty's voice came from the doorway. "Daddy, is Mary really my sister?" Edward held out his arms, and Betty ran to him. "Yes, sweetheart, and we're going to make things right." But as he held his daughter, Edward knew making things right wouldn't be easy. Somewhere in this house, Martha had kept this secret for 10 years. His lawyers would need to investigate the adoption records, find out how Mary ended up on the streets. And most challenging of all, he would need to help 2 little girls become sisters after a lifetime apart. The moonlight streamed through the study windows, casting shadows on the family photos that lined the walls. Tomorrow, Edward would begin the process of uncovering the truth. But tonight, under his roof, his daughters were finally together. It was a beginning. The next morning, Edward's kitchen was a scene he never could have imagined. 2 identical girls sat at the breakfast table, Betty in her pink silk pajamas, Mary in borrowed ones that were just a little too big. Martha served pancakes with trembling hands unable to look Edward in the eye. "Martha, sit down," Edward said firmly. "It's time you told me everything." Martha sank into a chair, wringing her hands in her lap. He'd started the day the twins were born. Mrs. Martin was so sick the doctors weren't sure she'd make it. When she saw both babies, she just broke down. She said she couldn't handle two, that it would be too much with her depression. Betty and Mary stopped eating, hanging on every word. She made arrangements with a private adoption agency, Martha continued, tears rolling down her cheeks. She told everyone one of the babies didn't survive. I helped her take little Mary to the agency. She made me swear never to tell anyone, said she'd fire me and make sure I never worked again if I did. Edward slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "And you kept this secret for 10 years, while my daughter was out there alone." "The agency was supposed to find her a good home," Martha sobbed. "I checked every year. They said she'd been adopted by a wealthy family in California. I never knew she ended up on the streets." Mary spoke up, her voice quiet but strong. "The family that adopted me died in a car crash when I was 6. Their relatives didn't want me, so I went back to the system. Nobody believed me when I said who my real father was." Betty reached across the table and took Mary's hand. The simple gesture made Edward's heart ache. "How did you find us?" Edward asked. "I saw Betty's picture in a magazine," Mary explained. "They were doing a story about rich families in town. She looked exactly like me. I've been watching the park for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Edward pulled out his phone and called his lawyer, Jack Thompson. Within an hour, his study was filled with legal teams and private investigators. They needed to verify Mary's identity, though Edward already knew in his heart she was telling the truth. They also needed to investigate how the adoption agency had lost track of her. While the adults talked, Betty showed Mary around the mansion. Edward could hear their voices drifting down the hallway. Betty excited to share her toys, Mary amazed at everything she saw. "I can't believe you have your own TV," Mary said, standing in Betty's room. "We can watch whatever you want," Betty replied. "And you can borrow any of my clothes. Oh, and wait until you see the pool." Edward listened to their chatter, his emotions a mix of joy and pain. These girls should have grown up together. They should have shared clothes and secrets their whole lives. Anna's decision had robbed them of so much. Later that afternoon, Edward's sister Catherine arrived, bursting through the front door in a whirlwind of expensive perfume and shocked expressions. "Edward, what is this I'm hearing about another daughter?" she demanded. "This will be all over the society pages by dinner. Have you thought about what this means for the family name?" Edward faced his sister calmly. "I don't care about the family name Catherine. I care about my daughter who has been alone for far too long." "But the scandal," Catherine protested. "The only scandal," Edward cut her off, "is that this family abandoned an innocent child. Now either help us make this right or leave." Catherine stood there, mouth open, as the sound of girls' laughter echoed from upstairs. Finally, her shoulders slumped. "What do you need me to do?" "Mary needs clothes, school supplies, everything," Edward said. "And more importantly, she needs family who will love her." That night, after both girls were asleep, Betty in her pink princess room, Mary in the newly prepared guest room next door, Edward sat in the garden, looking up at the stars. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from friends and business associates who had already heard the rumors. Tomorrow the story would probably hit the newspapers. Martha brought him a cup of coffee and hesitantly sat nearby. "I've packed my things, Mr. Martin. I'll be gone by morning." Edward was quiet for a long moment. "You knew my daughter was out there and you said nothing?" "Yes, sir." "You watched Betty grow up knowing she had a sister somewhere?" "Yes, sir." Edward took a deep breath. "You also took care of my family for 15 years. You were there when Anna died. You've loved Betty like your own." Martha wiped her eyes, waiting for the final judgment. "If you want to make things right," Edward said finally, "stay and help me with both my daughters. They're going to need all the love and support they can get." Inside the house, a small figure stood watching from an upstairs window. Mary pressed her hand against the glass, looking down at the only father she'd ever known, wondering if this dream could possibly last. The story of the Martin twins hit the morning papers exactly as Edward had expected. Millionaire's secret. "Daughter found!" screamed the headlines. Reporters camped outside the mansion's gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girls. "Don't worry about them," Edward told Mary as they ate breakfast. "They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." But Mary wasn't worried about the reporters. She was staring at Betty's private school uniform laid out for the day. Edward noticed her gaze and cleared his throat. "I've enrolled you in Betty's school," he said. "You'll start next week, after we get everything sorted out." Mary's fork clattered onto her plate. I don't know how to be in a fancy school. I can barely read." The room fell silent. Betty looked up from her cereal, surprised. Edward felt his heart break a little more. "Then we'll get you tutors," he said firmly. "The best ones. You'll catch up." "I want to help," Betty jumped in. "I can teach you everything I know." And so began the sisters' crash course in bridging their two different worlds. Every afternoon, Betty would spread her books across the library table, patiently helping Mary with reading and math. Mary soaked up knowledge like a sponge, determined to make her family proud. But it wasn't always easy. One day, Betty invited her best friends over without thinking. The girls stood in shocked silence when they saw Mary, whispering behind their hands. Mary ran from the room in tears. Edward found her hiding in the garden, behind the rose bushes Anna had loved so much. "I don't belong here," Mary sobbed. "Everyone knows it." Edward sat down beside her on the grass, not caring about his expensive suit. "You belong here more than anyone. You're my daughter and this is your home." "But I'm not like Betty," Mary whispered. "I don't know which fork to use at dinner or how to talk properly. Yesterday I ate my salad with the wrong hand and Catherine looked like she was going to faint." Edward couldn't help but laugh. "Catherine faints at everything, and you know what? None of that stuff matters. What matters is that you're here now." Meanwhile, Betty had sent her friends home and come looking for her sister. She stood quietly listening, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Betty said, stepping forward. "I shouldn't have invited them without asking you, and they're not really my friends if they're mean to my sister." Mary looked up, surprised by Betty's loyalty. The girls hugged and Edward watched as another small piece of the gap between them closed. But while the sisters grew closer, trouble was brewing. Edward's mother, Virginia Martin, arrived unannounced one afternoon. She swept into the mansion in a cloud of diamonds and disapproval. "Edward, darling," she said, air kissing his cheek, "I came as soon as I heard. This simply won't do." "Hello, Mother," Edward said coolly. "Have you come to meet your granddaughter?" Virginia's perfectly made-up face hardened. "I've come to help you handle this situation before it gets out of hand. I know a lovely boarding school in Switzerland." "No." Edward's voice was like steel. "Mary stays here." "But think of the scandal," Virginia protested. "Think of what this says about Anna, about our family." "I am thinking of our family," Edward replied. "My complete family, which includes both my daughters." The argument that followed was loud enough that both girls heard it from upstairs. Mary started packing her small bag, sure that she would be sent away. But Betty stopped her. "Daddy won't. So let anyone take you," Betty said fiercely. "And if they try, I'll run away with you." Mary looked at her sister, her twin, her defender, her new best friend, and slowly unpacked the bag. Downstairs, Virginia made her final threat. "If you insist on this foolishness, don't expect any more support from the Martin family fortune." Edward walked to the door and held it open. "Goodbye, Mother. Send me a postcard from your cruise." That evening, Edward took both girls out for ice cream. They sat in the park where Mary had first appeared, eating triple scoop cones and watching the sunset. "Is Grandmother going to cause trouble?" Betty asked, chocolate dripping down her chin. Edward handed her a napkin. "Probably, but we can handle it together." Mary licked her vanilla ice cream thoughtfully. "Why do rich people make everything so complicated? In the shelter, if someone was hungry, we shared our food. Simple." Edward and Betty stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. Mary joined in, and soon they were all giggling so hard their ice cream was melting forgotten. As they drove home, Edward watched his daughters in the rearview mirror. They were sitting close together, Betty showing Mary how to make friendship. Bracelets. The sight filled him with determination. No matter what his mother or anyone else tried, he would protect this newfound happiness. But Virginia Martin wasn't known for giving up easily. and as their car pulled away from the park, another car lingered in the shadows. Inside, a private investigator hired by Virginia was taking notes, looking for anything that could help separate the reunited family. Virginia Martin's private investigator didn't waste any time. Within a week, he had dug up everything there was to know about Mary's past, including some things that Edward wasn't prepared for. "Mr. Martin," the family lawyer said one morning, placing a thick folder on Edward's desk, "we found some concerning information about the adoption agency." Edward opened the folder and felt his blood run cold. The agency that had handled Mary's adoption had been shut down 5 years ago for illegal practices. The owner, Patricia Wells, had been arrested for selling babies on the black market. "There's more," the lawyer continued. "The family that adopted Mary? They weren't real. The agency faked the documentation. She was actually sold to a couple in Mexico, but she escaped and made her way back to the States." Edward's hands shook as he read the reports. His daughter hadn't just been given up. She had been sold, and Anna had known about it. Before he could process this information, Martha burst into the study. "Mr. Martin, come quick, the girls!" Edward ran to the backyard where Mary was face to face with Regina Wells, a teenager from the neighborhood. Regina was holding a newspaper and laughing. "So you're the street rat trying to steal the Martin fortune," Regina sneered. "My mum says your adoption wasn't even legal. You're probably not even their real daughter." Betty stood between them. "Take that back, she's my sister." "Betty, don't," Mary said quietly. "She's right about one thing. I did live on the streets. I did steal food to survive. I'm not ashamed of what I had to do to stay alive." Edward stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "Regina, go home and tell your mother if she spreads any more rumors about my daughter, she'll be hearing from my lawyers." After Regina stormed off, Edward gathered both girls in his arms. "Mary, honey, I need to tell you something about the adoption agency." Inside, Edward explained everything about Patricia Wells, about the illegal adoption, about how Mary had been trafficked. Betty held her sister's hand the whole time. "So, nobody ever really wanted me." Mary's voice was small. "No, sweetheart," Edward said firmly. "Your mother was sick. She had severe postpartum depression. She wasn't thinking clearly. And I should have asked more questions. Should have demanded to see. I failed you. But I want you now. We all do." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He paced his study, looking at old photos of Anna. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on his desk. Martha found him there at midnight. "You know what I keep thinking about," Edward said, his voice rough. "All those birthdays. Every year we threw these huge parties for Betty, and somewhere out there, Mary was alone. We can't change the past," Martha said gently, "but we can make the future better." The next morning, Edward announced at breakfast that they were going shopping. "Mary needs everything new, clothes, books, whatever she wants." "But Daddy," Betty interrupted, "Mary's birthday is the same as mine, and my party is next week." Edward smiled. "Exactly. We're throwing the biggest double birthday party this town has ever seen." The girls' excitement was contagious. They spent the day at the mall trying on matching outfits and picking out party decorations. Mary had never been in such fancy stores before. She kept checking price tags and gasping. "Don't worry about the prices," Edward told her. "You deserve all of this and more." But someone else was shopping at the mall that day. Virginia's private investigator. He snapped photos of Mary looking at price tags, of Edward's obvious guilt-driven spending, of every interaction that could be twisted to fit Virginia's narrative. Back at home, the girls were going through Betty's old photo albums when Mary suddenly stopped at a picture of Anna. "She was so beautiful," Mary whispered. "She was also very sick," Edward said from the doorway. "After you girls were born, she suffered from severe depression. The doctors tried everything, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make terrible decisions when they're in pain." "Did she ever get better?" Mary asked. Betty answered softly. "No, she died 2 years ago. She got really sad again and took too many pills." The room fell silent. Mary traced her birth mother's face in the photo. "Do you think she ever thought about me?" Edward sat down between his daughters. "I found this in her diary after she died. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. He pulled out a worn page. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "My other baby. My Mary, I'm so sorry. The darkness was too strong." Tears rolled down Mary's cheeks. Betty hugged her sister tight, and Edward wrapped his arms around both of them. But while the family comforted each other, Virginia Martin sat in her mansion across town, looking at the private investigator's photos. "Perfect," she said, picking up her phone. "Get me Patricia Wells. I don't care if she's in prison. I need to talk to her." The shadows of the past weren't done with the Martin family yet, not by a long shot. The day of the twins' birthday party arrived bright and sunny. The Martin mansion was transformed into a fairy tale wonderland, with flowers everywhere and twinkling lights strung across the garden. 2 identical birthday cakes sat side by side on a table decorated with purple and gold. The girls' chosen colors. "Is all this really for me too?" Mary asked, touching her new party dress. It was the same style as Betty's, but where Betty's was purple, hers was gold. "Of course it is," Betty said, adjusting her sister's hair bow. "We're making up for all the birthdays we missed." But while the girls got ready upstairs, drama was unfolding in the entrance hall. Virginia Martin had arrived early, bringing with her a woman nobody expected. Patricia Wells, the former adoption agency owner, recently released from prison. "Edward," Virginia called out sweetly, "there's someone here you need to speak with." Edward came down the stairs and stopped cold when he saw Patricia. "How dare you bring that woman into my house?" Patricia stepped forward, her prison-pale face set in a sympathetic expression. "Mr. Martin, I know you must hate me, but there's something you need to know about Mary's adoption." "Get out," Edward growled. "Both of you." "The adoption wasn't just illegal," Patricia continued, ignoring him. "It wasn't real at all. Mary isn't your daughter." The room went silent. Martha, who had been arranging flowers nearby, dropped her vase. "What are you talking about?" Edward demanded. Patricia pulled out some papers. "The real twin died, just like Anna said. This girl, she's one of our other babies. Anna came to us, grief-stricken about losing her baby, and asked us to find her a child who looked similar. She wanted to have a backup plan in case she ever felt guilty enough to confess." "You're lying," Edward said, but his face had gone white. "Am I?" Patricia smiled. "Check her blood type. Check her DNA. This girl is not a Martin." Virginia stepped forward. "I've already filed papers with the court, Edward. We need to find out the truth before this goes any further." Upstairs, Mary stood frozen at the top of the stairs, having heard everything. Betty was right behind her, holding her hand so tight it hurt. "It's not true," Betty whispered fiercely. "You're my sister. I feel it." Mary pulled her hand away. "I should have known it was too good to be true." She ran to her room and started throwing things into her old backpack. Edward bounded up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. "Mary, wait, we don't believe them." "Yes, you do," Mary cried. "I saw your face when she said to check my blood type. You believe her." "I believe in my heart," Edward said. "But if they're going to court, we need to prove them wrong. A DNA test will show everyone the truth. And what if it doesn't?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "What if I'm really nobody?" Betty burst into the room. "You're not nobody. You're my sister, and I don't care what any stupid test says." Down in the garden, guests were starting to arrive. Edward could hear their excited chatter, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. "Please," he said to Mary, "stay. Let's have the party. Tomorrow we'll deal with their lies." Mary looked out the window at all the decorations, at the twin cakes waiting to be cut. "Okay," she said finally. "One last party." The party went on, but there was tension in the air. Virginia sat in a corner, smirking. Patricia had been sent away, but her words hung over the family like a storm cloud. When it was time to cut the cakes, Betty insisted on switching their slices. "See," she said loudly, "we're sharing, like twins do." But later that night, after all the guests had gone home, Edward found Mary's bed empty. On her pillow was a "Toten nice. I can't wait for the test to tell me I don't belong. Thank you for giving me the best birthday ever. Please don't look for me." Betty came running in, holding up her piggy bank. "My money's gone. Mary must have taken it to run away." Edward grabbed his phone and called his head of security. Find her. Check the bus station, the train station, everywhere." As security, teams spread out across the city, Betty sat in Mary's room holding her sister's abandoned party dress. "She's wrong, Daddy. She does belong here." Edward pulled his daughter close. "I know, sweetheart, and we're going to find her and prove it." But Virginia watched from the doorway, a satisfied smile on her face. Her plan had worked perfectly, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that Martha had been recording everything on her phone from the moment Patricia Wells walked in. And right now, she was sending that recording to a very interested detective. The next morning, Edward hadn't slept a wink. His security team reported that Mary had been spotted at the bus station late last night, but the trail went cold. After that, she could be anywhere by now. "I've checked all her usual spots from before," Officer Sarah Thompson said, sitting in Edward's study. She'd been the one who used to help Mary when she lived on the streets. No sign of her at any of the shelters. Betty hadn't left Mary's room, convinced her sister would come back. She sat by the window watching the driveway. "She has to come back, Daddy. All her new things are here." But Edward knew better. Mary had left everything behind except the clothes she was wearing and Betty's piggy bank money. She didn't want to owe them anything. Martha burst into the study, waving her phone. "Mr. Martin, you need to hear this." She played the recording from yesterday, every word of Virginia and Patricia's conversation before they came into the house. Their voices were clear as they planned the whole thing. "Remember," Virginia was saying, "you just need to plant enough doubt. Edward's so guilty about the past, he'll believe anything that makes him feel worse." "And my payment?" Patricia's voice was eager. "Once the girl is gone, you'll get everything we agreed on." Edward's face turned dark with rage. "Call Detective Rogers," he told Martha. "Now." Across town, Virginia was enjoying her morning coffee when the police arrived at her door. Detective Rogers held up a warrant. "Mrs. Martin, we need to ask you some questions about conspiracy and intimidation of a minor." But Virginia just smiled. "You're too late. That little imposter is long gone, and good riddance." Meanwhile, Betty had convinced Edward to take her to the old neighborhood where Mary used to live. They drove slowly through the streets, showing Mary's picture to everyone they met. "She used to sleep there sometimes," an old homeless man told them, pointing to an abandoned building. "Behind the dumpster, safe spot." Betty's eyes filled with tears. "This is where my sister lived, while I had my own room and everything?" Edward felt sick. The building was falling apart, rats scurrying around the garbage. His daughter had slept here alone and afraid, while he lived in luxury less than 5 miles away. A small boy ran up to their car. "Hey, I know that girl. She gave me her jacket last winter." "Have you seen her today?" Edward asked desperately. "Maybe," the boy said. "But Mary always told us not to tell anyone where she goes. She protects us." Betty got out of the car and walked over to the boy. "I'm her sister, her twin sister. Please, we need to help her." The boy looked at Betty for a long moment. "There's an old church, 2 blocks that way. She likes the benches. Behind it." They found Mary's backpack behind the church, but no Mary. Inside was Betty's piggy bank, still full. She hadn't taken a single penny. "She couldn't do it," Betty whispered. "She couldn't steal from me even though she needs it." Edward picked up the backpack with shaking hands. A piece of paper fell out, a copy of the photo of the twins as babies. Mary had written on the back, "Even if it's not real, thank you for making me feel loved." Back at the mansion, Martha was going through Anna's old papers, looking for anything that might help. In a locked drawer of Anna's desk, she found a sealed envelope addressed to Edward, dated just before her death. Inside was a letter and a DNA test from 10 years ago. "Oh my God," Martha gasped, reading it. She grabbed her phone and called Edward. "Come home right now. You need to see this." But before Edward could get home, someone else found Mary first. Patricia Wells cornered her at a gas station where she was trying to buy food. "Your grandmother paid me a lot of money to get rid of you," Patricia sneered. "You should have stayed gone the first time." Mary backed away, scared. But suddenly, a police car pulled up. Officer Thompson stepped out, gun drawn. "Step away from..." "The girl, Patricia. You're under arrest again." Across town, Edward and Betty raced home to see what Martha had found. The letter from Anna was everything they needed. "My dearest Edward, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and my greatest sin has finally come to light. Mary is your daughter, your true daughter. I had a DNA test done the day she was born. She and Betty are identical twins. The story about her dying was a lie born from my illness. I was so sick, so afraid. I convinced myself I couldn't handle twins. Patricia Wells helped me hide the truth, but the guilt has eaten at me every day. Since I'm including the DNA test results. Find her, Edward. Find our daughter and give her the life she deserves, and please, forgive me. All my love, Anna." Edward fell into his chair, overwhelmed. The DNA test results were official, undeniable. Mary was his daughter, had been all along. "We have to find her," Betty cried. "We have to tell her." Edward's phone rang. It was Officer Thompson. "We've got her, Mr. Martin. She's safe. And you'll never guess who helped us find her. Your other's driver. Seems he didn't agree with what she was doing." "Where?" Edward was already grabbing his keys. "The hospital. She's a little dehydrated, but she's okay. And Mr. Martin, we've arrested Patricia Wells. She confessed everything." Betty was already running to the car. "Hurry, Daddy. My sister needs us." As they drove to the hospital, Edward gripped the steering wheel tight. His mother's betrayal, Anna's confession, Mary's pain. It was all tangled together. But one thing was crystal clear. His family was about to be whole again. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Edward and Betty ran toward Mary's room. They found her sitting up in bed, looking small and tired in the white hospital gown. Officer Thompson stood guard at the door. "Mary!" Betty flew across the room and threw her arms around her sister. "Don't you ever run away again." Mary started crying. "I'm sorry. I just couldn't bear to hear that I wasn't really your sister." Edward pulled out Anna's letter with shaking hands. "But you are. You always were. Read this." As Mary read the letter, her eyes grew wide. Edward spread the DNA test results on her bed. "See? You're my daughter. You're Betty's twin. You're exactly where you belong." "Mom really did love me." Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "She was very sick," Edward explained gently. "But yes, she loved you. And she wanted us to find you." A commotion in the hallway interrupted their reunion. Virginia Martin was being led past in handcuffs with Detective Rogers right behind her. "You can't arrest me," Virginia was shouting. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am," Detective Rogers replied calmly. "You're someone who conspired with a convicted felon to harass and intimidate a minor, and we have it all on tape." Virginia caught sight of Mary through the door, and her face twisted with anger. "That girl has ruined everything. The Martin name—" "That girl," Edward interrupted, stepping into the hallway, "is my daughter, and her name is Mary Martin." He turned to the detective. "Make sure the charges stick this time." Back in the room, Betty was showing Mary all the get-well cards her classmates had made. Everyone at school was so worried. Even Regina wrote one. She says she's sorry for being mean. Martha arrived with fresh clothes for Mary and tears in her eyes. "The house isn't the same without you, dear. And I made your favorite chocolate chip pancakes for when you come home." "Home," Mary repeated the word like she was tasting it. "I can really come home?" "Of course you can, sweetheart," Edward said. "It's where you belong. It's where you've always belonged." The doctor came in to check Mary one last time before discharge. She's dehydrated and exhausted, but nothing a few good meals and rest won't fix. As they drove home, Mary sat in the back seat with Betty, their hands clasped tight. The girls whispered and giggled together, already planning to redecorate Mary's room. "We can paint it gold to match your party dress," Betty suggested. "Can we really?" Mary looked at Edward hopefully. "We can do anything you want," Edward promised. "Your room, your home, your life. It's all really yours now, forever." But when they pulled up to the mansion, Mary hesitated at the front door. "What about grandmother? Won't she try something else?" Edward knelt down to look his daughter in the eyes. "Your grandmother made her choice. She chose hate and lies over family. But we're choosing love and truth. And nothing will ever separate us again." Inside, the staff had put together a welcome home dinner. Mary's favorite foods were all there, along with a cake that read, "Welcome home, Mary Martin," in purple frosting. "Look what else we found," Martha said, bringing out a baby book. "Your mother kept one for each of you. This one is yours." Mary opened it carefully. Inside were her footprints from the hospital, a lock of baby hair, and photos of her first days of life. "She really did love me," she whispered. "Of course she did," Betty said. "Just like we all do." That night, after dinner, Edward found the girls in Mary's room. They had pushed their beds together and were lying side by side, looking up at the ceiling where they had stuck glow-in-the-dark stars. "Daddy," Mary said softly, "is it okay if I call you that now?" Edward felt tears in his eyes. "I've been waiting 10 years to hear you call me that." "Then, good night, Daddy." "Good night, my sweet girls." As Edward walked downstairs, he found Martha in the kitchen baking more cookies. "Those girls are going to be spoiled rotten," he said with a smile. "They deserve it," Martha replied. "Especially Mary. We have a lot of love to make up for." Edward picked up Anna's letter from his pocket, reading it one more time. "I wish she had told me. We could have helped her, could have kept both our girls. We can't change the past," Martha said gently. "But look what we have now, 2 beautiful daughters together at last." Upstairs, the twins had fallen asleep, holding hands, their matching faces peaceful in the starlight. They were home. They were together and they were loved. But across town, in a jail cell, Virginia Martin was making a phone call. "Get me the best lawyer in the country," she hissed. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." Virginia Martin wasn't kidding about getting the best lawyer. Richard Stone arrived at the county jail in an expensive suit and a reputation for winning impossible cases. His first move was to get Virginia out on bail. "The charges won't stick," Stone assured Virginia as they left the courthouse, "and I have some ideas about the girl." Edward got the news during breakfast. The girls were planning their first day back at school together when his lawyer called. "They're challenging Mary's identity again," the lawyer said. "Stone is claiming the DNA test in Anna's letter could be fake. They want a new test." Mary's fork clattered to her plate. Even after everything, she still wasn't free from doubt. "No more tests," Betty said firmly. "We know the truth." But Edward knew they had to fight this battle the right way. "Mary, honey, would you be willing to take another test, just to shut them up once and for all?" Mary nodded bravely. "I want everyone to know I belong here." The DNA testing facility was cold and sterile. The technician took cheek swabs from both girls while Edward paced the waiting room. Stone was there too, watching with his snake-like smile. "You know," Stone said quietly to Edward, "Virginia is willing to drop everything if you just send the girl away. Give her a nice trust fund, set her up somewhere else." Edward's fist clenched. "That girl is my daughter, and if you or my mother go near her again, you'll regret it." Back at home, Martha was stress baking again. The kitchen smelled like cookies and worry. "What if the test results get lost?" Mary asked, helping Martha decorate sugar cookies. "What if someone changes them?" "Not going to happen," said a voice from the doorway. Officer Thompson stood there with Detective Rogers. "We're personally escorting the samples and results. No one's messing with this test." Betty hugged her sister. "See, everything's going to be fine." But that night, the nightmares came back. Mary woke up screaming, convinced she was back on the streets. Betty climbed into bed with her, and soon Edward came running in. "I dreamed they took me away," Mary sobbed. "That I had to leave you and Betty." Edward sat on the edge of the bed. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. You know what? Let me tell you about the first time I held you and Betty." The girls snuggled close as Edward described that day at the hospital. "You were so tiny, both of you. Betty was crying, but you were just looking around with these big, curious eyes. I counted all your fingers and toes twice." "Really?" Mary asked. "Really? And you know what else? You had a little birthmark on your left ankle. You still do." Mary's eyes went wide. She pulled up her pajama leg. There it was, a tiny heart-shaped mark. "That's why I never doubted you were mine," Edward said softly. "Not really. A father knows his children." The next morning, Virginia showed up unannounced at the mansion. Martha tried to stop her, but she barged right into the kitchen, where the family was having breakfast. "I've come to talk sense into you, Edward," she announced. "This circus has gone on long enough." But before Edward could respond, Betty stood up. "Grandmother, you need to leave." "Excuse me?" Virginia looked shocked. "You tried to hurt my sister. You tried to break up our family. You're not welcome here anymore." Mary stood up too, taking Betty's hand. "We're not afraid of you." Virginia's face turned red. "How dare you speak to me that way? Edward, control your children." Edward smiled proudly at his daughters. "They're right, Mother. You need to leave. And don't come back until you're ready to accept both my children." "This isn't over," Virginia spat as Martha showed her out. "Just wait until those test results. Come back." But 3 days later, the results arrived under police escort. Edward gathered everyone in the living room. The girls, Martha, their lawyer, even Officer Thompson and Detective Rogers. Stone and Virginia arrived last minute, both looking smug. The lawyer opened the envelope slowly. The room was so quiet, you could hear everyone breathing. "The results show," he paused, looking at Edward, "a 100% match. Mary and Betty are identical twins. There is no doubt." Betty jumped up, cheering. Mary burst into tears of relief, and Virginia looked like she'd been slapped. "This is impossible," she sputtered. "The test must be wrong." "It's over, Mother," Edward said firmly. "You've lost. Now get out of my house and stay away from my family." As Virginia stormed out, Stone trailing behind her, Mary turned to Edward. "Is it really over?" Edward hugged both his daughters close. "Yes, sweetheart. No more tests. No more doubts. You're Mary Martin, my daughter, Betty's twin sister forever." That night they had a celebration dinner. Friends from school came over, including Regina, who gave Mary a heartfelt apology. Martha outdid herself with a feast, and Officer Thompson brought ice cream for everyone. But in her mansion across town, Virginia sat in her dark study, drinking expensive scotch. On her desk was a file marked Mexico Adoption Records. "If they think this is over," she whispered, "they don't know me at all." Fall had turned to winter, and life at the Martin mansion had settled into a happy routine. Mary was catching up in school with Betty's help. The girls were inseparable, and Edward treasured every moment with his daughters. But Virginia Martin wasn't done. She sat in her study staring at an email from a private investigator in Mexico. "Found something interesting," it read. "Woman matching Anna's description visited orphanage in Tijuana 10 years ago with twin girls." Virginia smiled coldly and picked up her phone. "Book me a flight to Mexico, immediately." At the Martin mansion, the girls were decorating for Christmas. It would be Mary's first real Christmas, and everyone was determined to make it special. "Look what I found in the attic," Martha called, bringing down a box of old ornaments. Inside was a pair of baby's first Christmas ornaments, 2 identical angels. "Mom bought 2, Betty said softly, "even though she never forgot me," Mary finished, holding her angel carefully. Edward watched his daughters decorate the tree, his heart full. But a call from Detective Rogers shattered the peaceful moment. "Your mother just boarded a private plane to Mexico," Rogers said, "and she's been in contact with someone from Mary's past." Edward's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "There's an orphanage in Tijuana. We think Anna might have taken the girls there before bringing Betty back. Virginia's trying to find proof that Mary isn't who we think she is. But we have the DNA test. DNA doesn't matter if she can prove Mary was actually adopted in Mexico. International adoption laws could complicate everything." Edward hung up and immediately called his lawyer. But as they talked in his study, they didn't notice Mary standing in the doorway, hearing everything. That night at dinner, Mary was quiet. When Edward asked what was wrong, she put down her fork. "I remember Mexico," she said softly. "I didn't before, but I've been having dreams. A big white building. A lady crying, someone taking Betty away." Edward reached for her hand. "You were only 3, honey. Those might not be real memories. They feel real." Mary's voice shook. "What if grandmother finds something? What if they take me away?" "Nobody's taking you anywhere," Betty declared. "We'll run away first." But later that night, Edward found Mary in Anna's old room, looking at photos. "I look just like her," Mary said. "Just like Mom." "You do," Edward agreed. "You have her smile. Then why did she leave me there?" Mary's voice cracked. Edward sat beside her. "Your mother was very sick, sweetheart. She had severe postpartum depression. Sometimes people make terrible mistakes when they're suffering. But she came back for Betty. She was wrong. So wrong. And I was wrong for not asking more questions. But Mary, listen to me. You're home now. This is where you belong." The next morning, Virginia's plan started to unfold. News vans appeared outside the mansion. Martin heiress adoption scandal flashed across local news. Sources say Mary Martin was actually adopted from a Mexican orphanage, a reporter announced. Questions arise about the legitimacy of her claim to the Martin fortune. Edward's lawyer arrived looking grim. They're filing for an emergency hearing. Virginia claims she has proof that Anna adopted Mary in Mexico. "But the DNA test," Edward started. "Doesn't matter if they can prove she was legally adopted by someone else first. We could be looking at an international custody battle." Mary watched the news from her room, tears rolling down her cheeks. Betty sat beside her, holding her hand. "I won't let them take you," Betty promised. "You're my sister." But that night, Mary made a decision. She wrote a note and left it on her pillow. "Dear Daddy and Betty, I love you too much to let Grandmother destroy our family. If I go back to Mexico voluntarily, maybe she'll leave you alone. Please don't look for me this time. Love, Mary." She took nothing with her except a photo of the family and her baby's first Christmas angel. But as she reached the front gate, a voice stopped her. "Going somewhere?" Martha stood there in her robe holding a phone. On the screen was a video playing, security footage from 10 years ago. It showed Anna at the Mexican orphanage, but she wasn't leaving Mary there. She was rescuing her. "Your grandmother's investigator found this but didn't watch the whole thing," Martha said. "Look." The video showed Anna arguing with orphanage staff, showing them papers, finally leaving with both twins in her arms. "She changed her mind," Martha explained. "She went back, for you the very next day. But by then her illness had convinced her it would be better to hide you. She thought she was protecting you from the pressure of being a Martin." Mary stood frozen, watching her mother carry her out of the orphanage. "She came back for me." "She did, honey. And now we have proof that you were never legally adopted in Mexico." Virginia's whole story falls apart. As if on cue, Edward and Betty came running out in their pajamas. "Don't you dare leave us again," Betty cried, hugging her sister. Edward wrapped his arms around both girls. "We're going to fight this together, as a family." But up in her plane, Virginia Martin smiled. As the Mexican coast came into view, she had one last card to play, and this time she was sure it would work. Christmas Eve arrived with snow falling softly outside the Martin mansion. Inside, the family waited anxiously for news from Mexico, where Detective Rogers had followed. "Virginia. Try to enjoy the holiday," Edward told the girls. "Virginia can't hurt us anymore. We have proof now." But just then, Edward's phone rang. It was Detective Rogers. "You need to get down to the station right now and bring the girls." At the police station, they found Virginia sitting in an interview room looking defeated. Beside her was an elderly Mexican woman in a nun's habit. "This is Sister Maria," Detective Rogers explained. "She worked at the orphanage 10 years ago. Virginia found her, thinking she would help prove Mary was adopted there." Sister Maria stepped forward, looking at Mary with tears in her eyes. "I remember you, Pequeña, and your mother. She was so sad when she brought you and your sister." Mary gripped Betty's hand tight. "But she came back the very next morning," Sister Maria continued. "She was crying, saying she had made a terrible mistake. She needed both her babies. She had all the right papers, so of course we let her take you both home." Virginia stood up sharply. "You're lying. Anna told me." "Anna was sick," Sister Maria said gently. "Very sick. She came back several times over the years, always watching. Mary from a distance. She would bring donations, ask about her. Her guilt was eating her alive." Edward sank into a chair. "She knew where Mary was all along?" "Until the accident that sent Mary to the streets, yes. After that, she couldn't find her. It broke her completely." Sister Maria pulled out a stack of letters. "She wrote these to Mary, but never had the courage to send them." Mary took the letters with shaking hands. Each envelope had her name written in her mother's handwriting. "I found Sister Maria," Virginia said quietly, "but she didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me the truth instead." She looked at Mary for the first time without hatred. "I was wrong about everything." Detective Rogers stepped forward. "Mrs. Martin has agreed to drop all charges and legal challenges. She's also confessed to conspiracy and witness tampering in the Patricia Wells case." "I'm sorry," Virginia whispered, "to all of you." Edward put his arms around his daughters. "Let's go home." Back at the mansion, the family gathered around the Christmas tree. Mary sat with her mother's letters, reading them one by one. They were full of love, regret, and hope that one day she would understand. "She never stopped loving you," Betty said, wiping away her sister's tears. Martha brought out hot chocolate and Christmas cookies. Outside, carolers began singing "Silent Night." "There's one more surprise," Edward said, bringing out an envelope. "I've had my lawyers working on this for months." Inside was an official document, Mary's updated birth certificate, legally acknowledging her as Mary Claire Martin, born 7 minutes after Elizabeth Ann Martin. "Now it's official in every way possible," Edward said. "No one can ever question who you are again." Mary hugged the paper to her chest. "I know who I am. I'm your daughter. I'm Betty's sister. I'm home." As the snow fell outside, the family settled in to watch Christmas movies. Betty and Mary curled up together under a blanket, their matching Christmas angel ornaments twinkling on the tree above them. Edward watched his daughters, thinking about the long journey that had brought them here. About Anna, who had loved their girls so much but had been too sick to show it the right way. About second chances and healing and the true meaning of family. Martha came in with more. Hot chocolate. "Look," she said, pointing out the window. "A shooting star." "Make a wish," Betty told Mary. Mary smiled, looking around at her family. "I don't need to. I already have everything I ever wished for." Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Edward went to Anna's old room. He placed the stack of her letters to Mary in a special box, along with the DNA test, the birth certificates, and the security footage from Mexico. "They're both home now," he whispered to Anna's photo. "They're safe. They're loved. You can rest. Easy." Upstairs, the twins slept peacefully, their matching faces serene in the glow of the Christmas lights. On their bedside table stood a framed photo, not the old faded one from Mary's backpack, but a new one taken just that evening. Edward, Betty, and Mary, all together, all smiling, all exactly where they belonged. And in her jail cell, Virginia, Martin held a copy of that same photo, finally understanding what she had almost destroyed, and what really mattered in the end. The end.